But this was a very interesting idea that Browning has, that these are just ordinary guys doing this. They're in this circumstance, they're given an order, and so they just feel, most of them feel like they just need to follow through with it. They do this voluntarily. Obviously, there's some peer pressure to do it, but some of these men are able to back out, and yet most of them continue to do this. And so this is what Browning sort of postulates, and this fits very well in with the sort of psychological notion about people who commit these sort of evil acts, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychology behind this in a minute, but it does make, for me, it gives me maybe a little bit more of a leaning toward a structural explanation of this stuff, though I obviously think the intentional explanation is in there too. Okay? But let's talk a little bit about what Goldhagen said. Go back to Hitler's Willing Executioners, this book by Goldhagen, and it seems that Browning's book about the ordinary men flies in the face of Goldhagen. That Goldhagen is saying that the Germans, because of their unique history and their unique history of anti-Semitism in the past, have a sort of character flaw that causes them to become eliminationist anti-Semites. And yet we see these ordinary men, and they do not appear to fit the bill that Goldhagen is talking about. Okay? Now, again, I'll mention that other police reserve battalions in the book do seem more like what Goldhagen would describe them as. So there's both, I think, present in the book. But certainly the Police Battalion 101 do not seem to really fit with Goldhagen's idea, flaw in the German character. Now the thing about this idea about this flaw in the German character, this is something, unfortunately, I think, especially unfortunately for modern Germans, persists as a stereotype. And the media is really, really, really terrible about this. Absolutely terrible about this. I think in American media, you rarely see modern Germans presented as modern Germans. You see Germans presented as Nazis, and the Nazis are always bad and evil, right? Case in point, you guys know this movie? Hellboy, right? He's a robotic cyborg Nazi SS with the Totenkopf hat, there you go. Very typical. And Germans are either presented like this, fundamentally evil, robotic, evil, soulless beings, or they're presented like this. And this show is probably too old for you guys to remember, but this was a show called Hogan's Heroes, and it was run in the middle 60s in the United States, back when there were only 3 TV stations. And so the viewership of this show would, if anybody who's in the TV industry nowadays, would just basically, their head would explode to get the viewership. 30 to 60 million people watching this show. Nobody in the TV world nowadays, we have 500 channels, would get anywhere near this. So this show was watched by a huge number, maybe a quarter of the people in this country. And it was a long-running show. It was very popular. It was about this POW group, American POWs, but other English and French, who were in this not a concentration camp, in a prisoner of war camp, and they were running sabotage operations, and they had tunnels and everything. And they were able to do this because the Germans were just dumb, stupidly blindly following orders, and they were just gullible and stupid. And at least the Germans on the bottom were gullible and stupid, and that's why the Nazis could make them do things. And this is the other stereotype you had of the Germans. Even the mean ones in the show, like the Gestapo guy in the show, not very smart, right? And so this is the other stereotype you see about Germans, especially Germans in the World War II era. And my feeling is that these stereotypes are very harmful, especially because Germany now is a very, very successful country, and people in Germany save a lot of money. All sorts of great stereotypes about Germans. They make great cars. You can think of other great soccer players. There's other really good stereotypes about Germans. Unfortunately, these stereotypes persist. And so I'm just going to encourage you, when you hear about Germany in the news, you hear about Germans in the news, please try in your mind to not succumb to these stereotypes. I think they're really terrible. But this is again, when people are looking at World War II and they're looking at, how could Germans do these sort of things, these stereotypes are what is how people rationalize their understanding of something like the Holocaust. Okay? And again, I will mention that Germany has done a good job. Germans have done a good job post-World War II, especially I think the generation, 1 or 2 generations removed from the war, have done a very good job of confronting, the Nazi past. My kid's taking German in high school now, and he was telling me the other day, his teacher's German American, but she goes to Germany and she has family there, and they actually discuss, they discuss the Holocaust, they discuss this stuff in class, and so even in American classes run by Germans, they're confronting this stuff, and in Germany, my understanding is this is routinely part of the education. They confront this, as opposed to places like, and I hate to say this because I love the Japanese, I love Japan, but opposed to places like Japan, where they have not done a very good job of confronting their past in World War II, and especially the atrocities and the genocide that the Japanese committed, mostly on the Chinese and some Russians and some Koreans thrown in. And as this gentleman was telling me, he's about Unit 731, which was a medical unit in Japan that they went to places like Manchuria, and they committed horrible atrocities on the local population. I mean, absolutely just mind-blowingly, anything is bad or worse than that the Nazis were doing in the concentration camps. And that's really saying a lot, because the Nazis did some pretty horrific things to people. And I'm going to talk about those things in a couple of weeks. I'll talk about Nazi doctors in a few weeks and talk to you about those. But the Japanese were doing these things, and as a country, as a people, the Japanese have not really confronted the legacy of World War II. And there are things like the rape of Nanking and things like this, which the Chinese will tell you they feel the Japanese have never really apologized for. And if you're in Beijing and you want to get somebody riled up, just start talking to them about Japan, and you'll find that we had a colleague here who's Chinese who grew up in Beijing, and I was in China with him, and we were talking, and he said something about the Japanese had taken out this article for Toyota cars, which are very popular, and it was driving through 2 Chinese statues, guardian statues, going between them and knocking the statues over, and people were up in arms because this is the Japanese, referring back to this invasion in World War II, and they were so pissed off. And he's a guy, normally a very calm guy. He was pissed off. He was really emotional about it. And this is in 2004. Many years after the atrocities of World War II. And yet he still feels very strongly about it. And a lot of Chinese people still feel very strongly about this. It doesn't prevent them from buying Toyotas, however. They love Japanese Toyotas and cameras and phones, and they love buying them, but they pissed off in the north. You go down the south of China, things are a little more muted because there was not as much atrocities going on in the south. There were some bad things. It wasn't quite as bad as up in the north, especially when you get up to Manchuria and places like that. It was really bad. So again, this class we're not going to cover that. But it's a very interesting subject. If I could work it into this class, if we had enough time, I'd like to tell you about Unit 731, but we're going to have to do another semester to do that. So, what does psychology tell us about this stuff? How, intentionalist versus structuralist arguments. The idea that ordinary people could do really bad things. Well, luckily in psychology, we have a few example experiments that have looked at this issue, either directly or indirectly. And the first one I want to talk to you about is, and you're going to get about this probably in some other classes as well, the psych majors, you'll hear about this in other classes. The first one is the Stanford prison experiment. And this was an experiment conducted by Philip Zimbardo, who was a professor at Stanford. He's still very active in the Western Psychological Association, the WPA. So those of you who go off to present a paper at the WPA, you may see Phil Zimbardo sitting around. Usually he's sitting there kind of relaxed. He's kind of a very dapper gentleman. He's an older gentleman. He's sitting there. He's usually surrounded by undergraduate female students hanging all over him, somewhat of a star. Got a little bit of the rock star thing going on. But way back in the, I can't remember, this was in the 70s, early 70s. It was in my hometown of Palo Alto, California, where Stanford University is, and he conducted an experiment. What he wanted to do is he wanted to study sort of what the conditions in prisons were like. And so he set up an experiment. he got the Stanford Psych Department to agree to let him use the basement, and he set the basement up as a mock prison. And he even went to the Palo Alto Police Department and got their cooperation, which would never happen now. And basically what happens is he put out a call for volunteers, research volunteers, paid them something, and they were randomly assigned to either be a guard or a prisoner. And these are males, randomly assigned to be a guard or a prisoner. And then what he did is the guards were given no training. They were given khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and sticks. The prisoners, very interestingly enough, were the Palo Alto Police Department sent a police car to their residences, picked them up, arrested them, just like they were being arrested for a regular crime, took them down to the station, booked them just like they would do any regular prisoner, and then drove them to the psych department at Stanford University into the basement and gave them over to the, quote, guards, right? So they really tried to make it very realistic. And then what they did is they processed the prisoners, they took their clothes, they gave them these smocks with numbers on them, they were assigned a number, and they were treated like prisoners. And here you see the guards here, mirrored sunglasses, the baton, and the khaki guard uniforms. And what happened very quickly, here's another better picture of the guard here. And what happened very, very quickly was that the prisoners and the guards fell into very stereotypical roles. Now, these guards are not especially sadistic people. They were just normal, ordinary men, ordinary students, pulled randomly out of the population. They didn't know they were going to be guards or prisoners. But they quickly took on the roles. And the prisoners took on the roles and became very submissive. And some of them had nervous breakdowns. Many of them felt dehumanized. The prisoners got into this sort of mindset where they became a little bit paranoid. The guards became a little paranoid. They think the prisoners are trying to escape. And they started to implement all sorts of sort of more draconian punishments, sexual humiliation, making them stand for hours, and making them do push-ups, addressing them only by number, these kinds of things. And these things, and this happened over about a week. It didn't take very long. It took them about a week, and they started to this stuff really started to escalate. And it got to the point where, and Zimbardo who was in the position of warden, he even got sucked into this. And by the end of the first week, his girlfriend, who later became his wife, came by to we're going to go out to dinner or something, and came by to get him, and he's like, oh, I can't go because the prisoners, they're planning a break, And she said, what is going on with you? Slap him in the face, snap out of it. And he's like, oh my God, and he had to shut the experiment down because it was really starting to get out of hand. And had it gone on longer, the abuse of the prisoners was really escalating and would have gone on and on. And again, this idea that ordinary men placed in a specific kind of contextual situation will start to do mean things to a subject group, right, to a subjugated group. And so again, this experiment was really, really impactful, and it still has a big impact in psychology because of that prison in Iraq where the prison guards, which included women, by the way, started to abuse the prisoners. These untrained soldiers who were there just to be in charge of these prisoners, and they started to abuse them, and it started escalating, right? And this is the same thing. When that came out, that they realized, they remembered about Zimbardo, and they called him to Congress and had him start testifying about this stuff. And he wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect, which is a very good book. Highly recommend it. And he wrote about all this stuff. Yes?
It's Abu Ghraib.
Abu Ghraib, yeah. And I don't pronounce it because I always get it wrong. Abu Ghraib prison, yeah. And again, if you also study prisons in general, you'll see that sometimes this abuse can happen in just regular prisons, Of course, it's more complicated than that, regular prisons, because you also like hierarchies among the prisoners as well. But this is something that has really gotten a lot of attention, more recently. And so, The Lucifer Effect is a very good book. I recommend reading it if you want to know more about this stuff. You see him frisking these guys, and it's just Here are the prisoners and their numbers, forced to do push-ups, wearing their smocks. So this is how you humiliate people. This is how you dehumanize them, right? Now, the other experiment I want to talk about is the Milgram experiment. Again, you psych majors have probably heard of this. As where Zimbardo's experiment was sort of an accident. He wasn't really looking to study the role of authority in his experiment. Stanley Milgram, on the other hand, directly took the inspiration of his experiment from the Holocaust. He was Jewish. He was wondering how people could possibly do these horrible things, and in his mind was sort of the common thinking at the time that these Nazis were just all psychopaths, and that normal people would never do these things. And just maybe 0.25% of people would undertake these sort of atrocities toward others. That was his idea, and he wanted to study this, but he was inspired by what happened in World War II. And so he set up the famous Milgram experiment. In this experiment, you have an experimenter. This is the scientist who is in on it. This is an actor or one of the researchers. You have the student who's also an actor, one of the researchers, and you have the person who's actually the real subject of the experiment, which is the teacher. And what the thing is, they say we're going to study word association tests. Okay, what comes to mind when you hear a word, or learning, how somebody can learn under sort of adverse condition. And so the idea here is that this guy is going to be read a bunch of words, and he has to pick the right answer, or read a question, he has to pick the right answer, and then if he gets the wrong answer, this guy's got a little machine which gives progressively higher shock. So it gets up to the point where the shock is, XXX lethal. I'll show you the machine in a second. And as this guy, each time he gets the wrong answer, he gets a higher shock. And the experiment was to see how far would people go in shocking other people. What level would they go at? How many would go up to the lethal level? And Milgram's hypothesis was something like 0.25%. I can't remember the exact number. It was very small. 1% or 0.25% or something, people would do this. Most people would not do it. And to give the punchline away, what he found out was, in his original experiment, about 65% of people would go all the way up to 100% of a lethal shock, which he was astounded at. You see, so the guy would be in there and you'd be like, ah! And this is a video clip from the original one. I don't know if this is still working or not. I don't think I have this anymore. No, that's not going to work. Sorry. But I have something better for you. By the way, this is the machine. Starts out here, small shocks, you get up to here, and these are lethal. Look at this machine. I mean, this thing is really formidable. Like, wow, it's got gauges on it, things, looks like this, XXX written on it, lethal dose, it looks really scary, right? And so here are the categories you had: slight, moderate, strong, very strong, intense, extreme intensity, danger, severe, XXX, right? You know what XXX means, not from the porno sense here. This is, XXX like Vin Diesel XXX, So this is the graph here. You can see the graph. It goes all the way down here. So, I mean, half of people went to 80% of people went to very strong, right? 75 people went to intense, 70% to extreme intensity, 68% to danger severe, and 65% to XXX, lethal dose. Okay. Now, this experiment has been redone in many places, in many cultures, and the results pretty much seem about the same everywhere. And so one thing this tells us, when you see the results coming from different places, different cultures that are pretty similar, what this tells you is that this is probably not something culturally learned. This may have something more to do with, in my opinion, human evolution. Yes?
Was the teacher in the same room as the person being experimented?
No, they were in a different room. Very good. So, to give you guys a real visual feel of this, I'm going to show you a recreation of this stuff. So it's been done in many countries, many different places. There's been variants of the experiments. All the people who've done this, it's come out very similarly. Okay, and that tells you there may be something in the underlying biological strata or how the brain is programmed that has to do with this. And again, this fits into my argument that I was making to you, in my lecture on genocide. That human beings, it seems like primates, we have some primate programming around this stuff. In certain situations that we are willing to go along with the group, even though we realize what we're doing may be not such a good thing. Okay, but we want to go along with the group Especially we want to have obedience to authority. And this is what Milgram has entitled when he wrote about this. He was looking at obedience to authority. That we have an ingrained, inborn predilection to being to obedience to authority, or people in our group who have higher status, okay, have some sort of authority. And so you cannot do this experiment now as a psychologist. This would be considered to probably be pretty much would never pass a review board, an IRB board. If you were doing your 301 class and you decide, I want to redo the Milgram experiment, which probably half the people in this class who've taken this class would want to do for 301. I mean, I would want to do it for 301, but you're not going to be allowed to do that. You cannot do this ethically. It's not an ethical, no longer considered an ethical experiment. So psychologists cannot do this experiment, but guess who can do this experiment?
Reality shows.
Reality TV shows, yes, because producers, they have an army of lawyers, they get people to sign waivers, and especially if you don't do it in the United States, because where you're not so sue happy, you do someplace like England where people don't sue each other as much, and you're a reality TV show producer, yes, you may redo this experiment. And so the recreation I have, I think it's from 2009, it's by a guy named Derek Brown. I don't know if you've seen his shows. He does very, very interesting shows that are very science-based. And I recommend, if you're interested in watching some really cool, science-type TV, his stuff's really good. He does a almost exact recreation of the Milgram experiment. It's the best one that I've ever seen. Very, very, very exact. He follows the same protocols, the whole 9 yards. And he does this in Britain. It's part of a bigger show where they're trying to pick people to go on a sort of fake bank heist or something. But that's part of it. But this is the episode they did. They just redid the Milgram experiment. So I thought I might show you guys. So if you want to, I think this is worth seeing, and you really get a sense of how the experiment goes by watching. And you'll see what he found out as circa 2009.
So, a week ago, I arranged for them to take part in what they now think is a piece of unfilmed academic research at a university, and nothing to do with the show, supposedly looking into the effects of punishment on learning. And they believe now that this is part of their growth process. In fact, it was a reenactment of a powerful experiment conducted by Stanley Milgram in 1963 to look at how normal people can commit atrocious acts simply because they're following orders. Milgram's parents were Jewish refugees in World War II, and his pioneering work speaks volumes about the nature of responsibility. It's being filmed with covert cameras.
Thank you. Come in.
They're introduced to an actor pretending to be another participant.
You didn't come from the same room?
No.
You don't know each other?
No.
We don't actually know how punishment affects learning.
After a brief introduction, our subjects are tricked into thinking they've chosen their role as teachers in the experiment.
And if you could just tell me what your positions are?
Learner.
Learner and teacher.
Learner.
Teacher.
Our subjects observe the learner being instructed by the scientist, who is just another actor.
This electrode is connected to a generator in a second room. We
Right.
might be going with the teacher.
Okay.
Just make sure that we have a good contact with the skin and so it doesn't cause any blistering or burning. Is that comfortable?
That's okay, yeah.
Yeah, and we just place these straps around your arms just to avoid any excess movement. Those aren't too tight.
No, that's okay.
No. The teacher will read out some word pairs to you. Blue girl.
The learner is told he's going to be asked a series of memory questions by the teacher. He will have to remember word pairs and then correctly remember them when offered multiple choices.
If the answer's incorrect, you will receive an electric shock.
The teacher is then taken next door and shown the generator, which ranges from 15 volts all the way up to a lethal 450 volts. The domestic electricity supply in the UK is, of course, 240 volts. Our teachers are given the list of questions and told to increase the voltage each time the learner gets a question wrong. They are then given an example of a low voltage shock.
And try and estimate in volts the amount of shock you feel you're getting.
Okay. Jesus. Oh, shit.
Do you know how much that was?
Enough.
75.
It was actually 45.
Oh my God.
Teacher, begin.
Shoe
horn.
Steam.
The point of this test is to see whether the teachers, our subjects, will call a stop to the experiment or continue to the point where they are administering seemingly lethal electric shocks to the victims simply because the scientist is telling them to.
That's correct.
According to plan, our accomplice provided many wrong answers. Each protest was coordinated to a particular shock voltage on the generator, and his responses were played via a CD.
That's wrong, 150 volts. The correct answer is Captain Shoe. Cup. That's wrong. 225 volts.
Ow! Take it off! I've had enough of this!
He's in a lot of pain,
Continue, please.
but he's not comfortable.
We must continue to the end of the experiment. Whether the learner likes it or not, he has to go on until he's learnt the words correctly.
Okay. Forest. That's wrong, 240 volts. Are you sure this is not causing any lasting damage? He sounds like he's in a lot of pain.
Well, the shocks might be painful, they're not harmful.
What does that mean, though? They're not harmful. Sorry, I'm not getting you. When you say that they might be painful but not harmful.
They cause no long-term damage.
Okay, so what does that mean? That it doesn't leave any scars?
It causes no damage.
That seems very cold and calculated to me. This doesn't seem like a very. Anyway, golden. That's wrong, mate. 300 volts.
Ow! That's enough! I refuse to answer anymore! Just let me out!
Staple. The options are diet, jar, balcony, and bowl. I'm gonna answer.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, say 4 to 5 seconds, then you have to treat the answer as wrong and follow that procedure.
Did you hear that, learner? Just any response, mate. Come on. Wild guess.
Please continue.
345 volts. If you're still with me, I'm sorry. I can't do this, honestly. Can we stop this experiment? Because I can't do this.
If you don't continue, we'll have to discontinue the experiment.
Yeah, okay, fine. That's fine. I'm not going to do this.
Incorrect. 405 volts. Sorry, I don't know. Does someone want to check on him or something? It's just he's not making any noise now, and he was before. And well, I'm quite happy to go on, but I'm just a bit worried about.
If you would continue.
Yeah, I'm just a bit worried because he was like he was like complaining before about the.
But no harm will come to him.
But he's not making any noise now.
It's essential that we continue with the experiment.
Balcony. Incorrect. 450 volts. You promise he's not. It won't.
Please continue with the procedure.
You say it hurts, but it's because it's like it says they're dangerous severe shot. It'll be all right. Yeah.
Please continue. Okay, I think we'll discontinue the experiment there.
All of the subjects were told the true nature of the experiment was to see how they would respond to authority, and that it would eventually form part of this show.
He is okay.
I can tell you, yeah, he's absolutely fine. You actually weren't administering electric shocks to him at all. He is.
In the original Milgram experiment, psychologists were asked to predict how many people would continue to the point that they were administering the highest shock on the board. Their prediction was 0.1%. They were wrong. The results of our experiment were almost identical to the original. Over 50% of participants continued up to 450 volts. The majority of people will administer lethal electric shocks just because a guy in a white coat is telling them to.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450.
The Milgram experiment. I think it's a very well done thing. Now, just for a second, if you can imagine that the person telling you to do the experiment is not a scientist in a white lab coat, but instead is a police officer or somebody in the military, police officer who has authority over you, that could send you off to a camp, who could cause some privation to your family, who you had some fear of, not just a sense of authority, but also a fear of this person. Imagine that. What do you think that percentage would be? People who went all the way to the end. Think it would be higher? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, it gives you some sort of insight, to maybe what was going on with, these ordinary men, some other people who were doing these kind of things. That's not to say that there weren't, there weren't, psychopaths and other people who were willing to do really nasty stuff. And we talk a little bit about the camp system. We'll see that a lot of times some of the camp system people were really essentially chosen because of their, their record of being willing to engage in sort of sadistic acts. Not all of them, but there definitely in some cases that was the case. Okay. All right. There's Milgram. Now, very interestingly enough, this experiment you've done in the 60s at a time when people were really questioning authority. I don't know if you guys don't know much about this, but in our country in the 1960s we had a war in Vietnam. A lot of people were really against it, and students, people your age, were doing a lot of protesting. We were going up. We had armed guards, National Guard people. In some cases, like in Kent State, students were shot for protesting. Many of them were maced. Many were arrested, many were beaten. This is something you guys probably don't remember because you're too young, but I remember it growing up. I lived near Stanford University campus, and they had a couple of very, very big protests there that were violently put down by the authorities, and I can remember that really quite well. And so this was something going on. And again, this idea of obedience to authority was really being questioned by young people. And I'm not going to go into this, but I have a case here of one of the Milgram's subjects here who refuses to go on with the condition, and Milgram is really impressed that she's so poised and just and so self-assured, that she's sure that she doesn't want to go on. And the things, it turns out she is a German immigrant who had been in the Hitler Youth as a child and grew up in Hitler's as an adolescent in Hitler's Germany, and was exposed to Nazi propaganda. And yet, obviously she had learned from her experience of being in the war under the Nazis that this is just definitely not the way to go. So again, Germans are not evil Nazis or blindly stupid people following orders. That they're, especially modern generation Germans, hopefully have learned from the experience of World War II. And again, I think personally, I think you can see this in the German nation today. The way that it's structured, the way that they conduct themselves, the way that they've been so successful. Germany has really taken a lead role in the European Union. You know, I think Reiner showed you the slides, the Greek people saying, yeah, this is now they're taking over again, like they're doing the Nazi. Then now they figured out another way to take over everything. But the truth of the matter is they've just had very good, solid policies. And, you know, they have all sorts of great things about being in Germany. You know, they've got great social systems, all sorts of wonderful things. Okay? So, again, just to try to reiterate this stereotype, you know, don't fall for the stereotypes.